Marriage isn't just about love, it's about standards, and you are not good enough for this family. She took the microphone near my vows and told everyone wasn't good enough for their fae. Right there, in front of everyone.
There was a split second after those words landed, where no one knew how to react. Because this wasn't a slip. It wasn't emotion. It was a message, delivered at the one moment meant to be untouchable. The bride didn't respond. She couldn't, and the silence that followed was louder than the sentence itself. What happened next didn't unfold quietly. It unfolded in front of witnesses, with no way to take it back. And once humiliation happens publicly, it doesn't stay in the moment. I'm Emily Carter. I've planned weddings for years, and I've seen what happens when silence is mistaken for respect. Now, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated by someone who was supposed to be family and felt like you couldn't defend yourself in that moment? If this has ever happened to you, tell me in the comments. You're not alone. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what really happens behind perfect weddings. I remember the first time I met Sarah Thompson. She was sitting on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by fabric swatches and vendor contracts. Shoes kicked off, hair tied up in that distracted way people do when they're trying to hold too many things together at once. She didn't look stressed in the dramatic way people expect. She looked tired, in a quieter, more dangerous way. The kind of tired that comes from being careful all the time. She kept apologizing for the mess, even though there wasn't any. That alone told me more than she probably realized. Charleston was her dream. The waterfront venue, the open air, the way the light hit the water right before sunset. She'd been saving for years, picking up extra freelance work, skipping vacations, saying no to little indulgences because she wanted this one day to feel intentional, not extravagant. Intentional. There's a difference. And brides who understand it usually carry the weight of the planning differently. Christopher Collins arrived late to that first meeting. Not egregiously late. Just late enough that he missed the beginning of the conversation and slipped into a listening role without noticing. He was polite, agreeable, eager to keep things smooth. The kind of groom who nods before he fully processes what he's agreeing to. Margaret Collins wasn't there, but her presence already was. Every time Sarah mentioned a decision flowers seating, even the officiant there, was a pause before she added, "Margaret has some thoughts about that." Not objections, thoughts, suggestions framed as traditions, preferences framed as expectations, and always positioned as reasonable. I've learned to listen closely to the words people choose when they're trying not to sound controlled. Margaret's financial contribution, Sarah explained carefully, was symbolic. A gesture tied to family customs, a way of being involved. The bulk of the cost came from Sarah and Christopher together. Though even there, Sarah's savings were doing most of the heavy lifting. She never said that with resentment. She said it like someone explaining math they'd already accepted. Christopher, when I asked about his mother's role, smiled in that apologetic way I've seen too many times. "She just wants what's best," he said. "She's very invested." Invested is a flexible word. It can mean love. It can also mean leverage. In the months leading up to the wedding, Margaret's involvement crept in through small doors. A request to review the ceremony order, a suggestion about where her family should sit, a gentle insistence that certain moments deserved a bit more attention. None of it loud, none of it rude. All of it just enough to make Sarah check herself before pushing back. And every time Sarah hesitated, Christopher smoothed it over. "It's not worth the tension," he'd say. "It's just one day." I remember thinking that weddings are never just one day. They're rehearsals for how conflict will be handled later, when the stakes are different, but the patterns are the same. The first real crack came when Margaret asked about speaking during the ceremony. Not a toast, not the reception. During the ceremony, just a brief word, she said. Something meaningful, something from the heart. She framed it as a blessing, a tradition, a moment of family acknowledgement before vows were exchanged. Sarah looked at me when she relayed the request, searching my face for confirmation that it was odd, that she wasn't imagining the discomfort tightening in her chest. I told her the truth. It wasn't common, it wasn't necessary, and it carried risk. Christopher, when brought into the conversation, hesitated. Not long, just long enough to show where the weight of the decision really sat. She wouldn't do anything inappropriate, he said. She just wants to feel included. That's when I felt it shift. Not dramatically, quietly. The way air changes before a storm you're not allowed to name yet. Because inclusion, when demanded at the wrong moment, stops being about connection and starts being about control. And once a microphone enters that equation, there's no such thing as a small moment anymore. Something shifted after Margaret asked for time during the ceremony. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no ultimatums. It was quieter than that, which is usually how these things become dangerous. Sarah started second-guessing decisions that had already been made. Not because she'd changed her mind, but because she was now trying to predict reactions that hadn't mattered before. She'd pause mid-sentence and ask me if a detail might feel too much or misinterpreted, even when it was well within the norm. It was as if the wedding had gained an unseen audience long before the guests arrived. Margaret's influence began arriving indirectly. A comment relayed through Christopher, a suggestion framed as concern, a question that sounded harmless until you noticed it was never actually a question at all. She wanted to review the ceremony language. She wondered aloud if the vows might be a bit modern. She asked whether Sarah planned to acknowledge the Collins family in a way that reflected their values. Every sentence was wrapped in tradition, in legacy, in respect, and Sarah absorbed all of it quietly. When I brought these moments to Christopher, he reacted with a familiar mix of discomfort and reflexive defense. He didn't dismiss Sarah's feelings outright. He just minimized them. "She's just nervous," he'd say. "She wants everything to feel right." There was always a smoothing motion to his words, like he was pressing wrinkles out of fabric without checking whether the fabric was tearing underneath. Margaret never contacted me directly. That, too, was deliberate. Everything traveled through her son, keeping him in the middle, forcing him to translate, soften, reframe. It kept the dynamic polite on the surface while tightening it underneath. Financially, nothing had changed. Sarah was still carrying most of the weight. The deposits, the late-night planning calls, the constant coordination. Margaret's contribution remained symbolic, but her authority didn't reflect that imbalance. It expanded anyway, justified not by money, but by lineage, by seniority, by the unspoken rule that family presence grants permission. I watched Sarah begin to shrink in conversations that used to excite her. Not visibly, just enough that you could feel her pulling back instead of stepping forward. She wasn't being dramatic, she was adapting. An adaptation, when it becomes a habit, often replaces consent without anyone noticing. The ceremony microphone kept coming up. Not loudly, just as a given. Margaret referred to it as if it were already settled, already appropriate, already hers. And Christopher never quite corrected that assumption. That was when I realized the boundary wasn't being crossed anymore. It was being quietly removed. The week before the wedding is usually when nerves spike for logistical reasons, whether timelines, guest counts, but with Sarah, the tension lived somewhere else entirely. It showed up in her posture, in the way she'd listen before responding, as if every answer required an internal calculation. Margaret arrived in Charleston 3 days early. She didn't announce herself as a problem. She never does. She positioned herself as help, as guidance, as a steady hand for a moment that means so much to the family. She walked the venue with Christopher, pointing out details she liked and others she found a little unconventional. She asked why certain choices had been made, not aggressively, just often enough that the question itself began to feel like pressure. Sarah stayed polite, gracious, almost deferential. I watched her defer to someone who hadn't stayed up late comparing vendors, who hadn't shifted budgets to accommodate last-minute changes, who hadn't carried the emotional labor of making sure everyone felt included. But Margaret spoke with the confidence of ownership, not contribution, and no one openly challenged that. The rehearsal was where it crystallized. Margaret asked, in front of the officiant, whether she'd be given the microphone after the bride's vows or before. She said it casually, like asking where to stand. The room went quiet in that particular way, where everyone waits for someone else to respond first. I looked at Christopher. He smiled, that same conciliatory smile, and said they'd figure out the timing. Not later. Just enough to keep things moving. Sarah didn't say anything. She nodded once, slow and controlled, like someone deciding not to disrupt the air, even though it had become hard to breathe. That was the moment I felt my role strain. As a planner, I manage flow. As a human, I felt the cost of silence solidifying into structure. This wasn't about one sentence or one speech anymore. It was about whose comfort mattered most at the most protected moment of the day. Margaret took that silence as confirmation. She spoke afterward about family legacy, about honesty, about how weddings are the last chance to speak truth before a life moves forward. Her words sounded ceremonial, but her eyes kept returning to Sarah, measuring something unspoken. When the rehearsal ended, Sarah lingered behind while others drifted out. She asked me quietly if it was too late to change things. Not the schedule, not the flowers, the boundaries. I told her the truth as gently as I could. It was only too late if everyone kept pretending this was still a small request. But the ceremony was less than 24 hours away, and the microphone was already waiting. The morning of the wedding didn't feel chaotic. It felt restrained, like everyone was moving carefully around something fragile without naming it. Sarah was calm in the way people get when they've already spent their fear. She sat while her makeup was done, hands folded in her lap, listening more than speaking. When someone asked how she was feeling, she smiled and said she was excited. And she meant it, just not in the uncomplicated way people expect from a bride. Margaret arrived early, dressed impeccably, carrying herself like someone stepping into a role she believed had been waiting for her. She greeted guests before the ceremony began, offering knowing smiles, touching arms, positioning herself as a central figure rather than a participant. It wasn't overt, it was practiced. I noticed how often she adjusted Christopher, straightening his jacket, whispering reminders, grounding him to her presence before he could drift too far into the moment he was supposed to be entering on his own. Sarah watched that from a distance. The ceremony setup went smoothly. Chairs aligned, aisle cleared, the microphone tested and placed exactly where it would be most visible. No one said anything about it anymore. That, in itself, was telling. When a boundary stops being discussed, it usually means it's already been conceded. As guests took their seats, Margaret spoke quietly with the officiant. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the gestures. A small laugh, a nod, a glance toward the front. She was framing herself as part of the ceremony's authority, not just its audience. Christopher didn't intervene. He stayed near her, close enough to hear, far enough to avoid being the one asked to decide. Sarah took a deep breath just before walking down the aisle. Not the kind people take when they're nervous about tripping or crying. The kind they take when they're bracing for something undefined but heavy. When she reached the altar, she looked steady, present, fully there. She spoke her vows clearly, without hesitation, her voice carrying over the quiet water behind the guests. She talked about partnership, about choosing each other, about building something separate and shared at the same time. It was sincere, grounded, earned. And as she finished, I saw Margaret shift in her seat, not impatiently, purposefully. She stood before anyone could react, reached for the microphone as if it had always been hers, and smiled toward the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed the moment belonged to her too. And that's when I knew the pattern we'd been watching quietly was about to become public. There's a specific kind of silence that happens when something inappropriate almost occurs. But people aren't yet sure whether they're allowed to react. I've stood inside it before. It's thick, heavy, polite in the most uncomfortable way. Margaret didn't speak right away. She held the microphone for a beat too long, letting the pause do some of the work for her. She looked out at the guests as if she were scanning familiar faces, grounding herself in the authority of being known. Then she laughed softly and said how emotional she was feeling, how proud she was of her son. That's how she eased in. She talked about family standards, about how marriage isn't just about love, but about responsibility, about how joining a family means understanding what's expected of you. Her tone stayed calm, almost reflective, but the content began to tilt, subtly, carefully. Each sentence slid a little closer to judgment without quite naming it. I watched Sarah's shoulders tighten. Margaret mentioned how Christopher had been raised, the values he'd been taught, the sacrifices made for him. Then she turned, physically turned, toward Sarah. Not aggressively, intentionally. She said she hoped Sarah understood the weight of what she was stepping into, that not everyone is prepared for the Collins family, but honesty before vows is a gift, a gift. No one interrupted her, not the officiant, not Christopher. He stood still, eyes forward, jaw set in a way that told me he was choosing endurance over confrontation, choosing familiarity over disruption. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't flinch, but the shift in her face was immediate. That moment where someone realizes they are no longer being spoken about, but spoken at, in front of witnesses. Without consent, Margaret wrapped it all in concern. In protection, she said she trusted Christopher's judgment, but felt it was her duty to voice what others might be thinking. She framed herself as brave for saying it out loud, as generous for stopping short of specifics. That restraint was strategic. It allowed people to fill in the blanks themselves. When she finally handed the microphone back, she smiled again, satisfied, as if she'd fulfilled an obligation. The ceremony continued because ceremonies are designed to keep moving even when something breaks inside them. The officiant regained his place. Christopher recited his vows, voice steady but distant. He spoke of support, of unity, of choosing Sarah. But something had already shifted, because words spoken in public don't disappear just because the schedule says it's time for the next part. And as the guests rose to applaud, I could feel the weight of what hadn't been addressed settling heavily between the couple. Waiting for a space where silence would no longer be an option. The ceremony ended the way ceremonies usually do: applause. Smiles that arrived a half-second late, people standing because that's what the moment asks of them. From a distance, it looked intact. Up close, it felt fractured. Backstage, the energy shifted immediately. The wedding party moved with purpose, ushering guests toward cocktails, resetting the space for the next phase. But Sarah stayed still for a moment longer than necessary. Bouquet clenched just tight enough to betray what she wasn't saying. Christopher leaned toward her and whispered something I couldn't hear. His tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic either. It was placating. The kind of tone used when someone hopes an emotion will pass if it isn't acknowledged. Margaret, meanwhile, moved freely among the guests. She accepted embraces. She laughed. She received reassurance. I watched relatives squeeze her hand and nod, as if she'd said something difficult but necessary. Authority reinforced socially, without a word exchanged. Sarah excused herself before the formal photos began. I found her in a quiet corridor near the preparation room, sitting on a low bench, veil pushed back, breathing slowly as if counting was the only thing keeping her anchored. She didn't ask if what had happened was okay. She asked if it was normal. That question alone told me how much ground she'd already lost. I told her the truth. It wasn't normal, and it wasn't accidental. When Christopher joined us, his body language shifted. He stood closer to the doorway than to Sarah, already bracing for conflict he didn't want to have. She asked him calmly, directly, why he hadn't stopped his mother. Not during, not after, at all. He said it wasn't the right moment, that making a scene would have made things worse, that Margaret didn't mean harm, that she was emotional. Every explanation centered on preserving something that already existed. Nothing centered on Sarah. Margaret appeared not long after, perfectly timed. She spoke as if the incident were complete, already behind them. She said she hoped Sarah understood it came from love, that families have to be honest, that this wasn't the day for tension. Sarah didn't respond, and that silence, measured, controlled, deliberate, changed the air in a way Margaret hadn't anticipated. Because silence can be compliance, but it can also be a line being drawn where words would only be used against you. The reception doors were about to open, and whatever had been contained by ceremony etiquette was about to face a space where people linger, observe, and remember. By the time the reception space was ready, the cost of what had happened was no longer abstract. It had weight. It slowed people down. It changed how bodies moved through the room. Sarah entered the reception smiling, because that's what brides do when the doors open. But the smile didn't reach the places it had earlier in the day. She greeted guests who congratulated her warmly, some a little too warmly, as if compensating for something they weren't sure how to name. Others avoided her eyes altogether, suddenly fascinated by table settings and centerpieces. Money shows up in moments like this in unexpected ways. In the hours she'd spent planning, in the personal savings she'd quietly redirected, in the emotional labor she'd absorbed to keep things peaceful. All of it had built a stage where someone else felt entitled to speak over her. Christopher stayed close, but not connected. He touched her arm when cameras appeared. He stepped back when conversations turned delicate. He was managing optics, not repairing damage. That distinction matters more than people realize. Margaret took a central table, not the head table, but close enough to command attention. She received guests like a matriarch receiving affirmation. Her earlier words reframed through whispers as concern, as honesty, as tradition. The narrative was already being rewritten socially without Sarah's participation. I watched Sarah notice this in pieces. A glance here, a pause there, each realization landing quietly, stacking instead of exploding. This wasn't a single wound, it was a cumulative one. At one point, she stepped away from the room entirely. No announcement, no tears, just a quiet exit through a side door meant for staff. I followed a moment later and found her near the water, the sound of the reception muffled behind her. She said something that stayed with me ever since. She said, "I paid for this day to start a life, and now I feel like I'm being assessed." That's when silence stopped being self-protection and became something else. A decision. A recognition that this wasn't about smoothing things over anymore. It was about whether the imbalance would be named or normalized. And inside the reception, the night was still young, which meant the consequences hadn't finished unfolding yet. There's a moment in some weddings when the music swells and people relax into celebration, believing the hardest part is over. This wasn't one of those weddings. The reception moved forward, but something fundamental hadn't been settled. And unresolved things have a way of pulling focus no matter how loud the band gets. Christopher finally found Sarah near the edge of the room, just beyond the circle of guests. He spoke softly, urgently, as if volume alone could determine whether a conversation counted. He told her they should enjoy the night, that they could talk later, that his mother didn't mean it the way it sounded. Later is a powerful word. It delays accountability without denying it outright. Sarah listened without interrupting. Her stillness wasn't resignation. It was assessment. She asked him one question, simple, unembellished, about whether he believed what his mother had said needed to be addressed publicly, the same way it had been delivered. Christopher hesitated. That pause mattered more than any answer he eventually gave, because in it lived the reality she'd been avoiding. That confronting his mother felt more dangerous to him than losing his wife's trust in that moment. He said it wasn't the time, that it would only create more drama. That people would remember the confrontation instead of the wedding. What he didn't say was that people were already remembering something else. Margaret watched from across the room, expression composed, posture relaxed. She didn't approach. She didn't need to. The work had already been done. Her authority had been exercised publicly and left unchallenged. That kind of power doesn't require maintenance. It settles. Sarah nodded once when Christopher finished speaking, not in agreement, in understanding. the kind that arrives when a choice becomes unavoidable, even if it isn't immediate. She rejoined the reception after that, but differently. Less available, less open. She danced when asked. She thanked people when they spoke, but there was a distance now, carefully held. Like someone stepping back to see the full shape of something they'd been standing inside. I've learned that this is the point where relationships either recalibrate or calcify, where silence either breaks or becomes permanent architecture. The night continued. Speeches were made, glasses were raised. But the balance had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if no one dared to say why. Public moments don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they happen because no one stops them. The reception was settling into its rhythm when Margaret stood again. This time, there was no microphone handed to her by mistake. She took it deliberately, lifting her glass with practiced ease, smiling as the room responded the way rooms always do when they recognize authority. "A toast," she said. Just a few words, people quieted, chairs angled, attention gathered. Sarah was mid-conversation when she realized what was happening. She turned slowly, already too late to interrupt, without becoming the disruption herself. That's the cruel genius of social settings like this. Once a moment has been framed as celebration, resistance is made to look rude. Margaret spoke about family legacy, about standards that endure, about how marriage tests character. Her words were careful, polished, but the implication was unmistakable. She referenced strength, suitability, the importance of knowing who you're standing beside when life gets difficult. She never used Sarah's name. She didn't have to. The room reacted in fragments. Some guests nodded, mistaking gravity for wisdom. Others shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the couple. A few people looked directly at Sarah, then away, as if witnessing something they didn't want to be responsible for seeing. Christopher stood frozen. He didn't take the microphone. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even step forward. His silence, in that moment, spoke with more clarity than Margaret ever could. It wasn't neutrality. It was alignment through inaction. Sarah felt it immediately. You could see it in the way her posture changed, how her shoulders drew back, not in defense, but in resolve. This wasn't shock anymore. This was confirmation. Margaret finished to polite applause, not enthusiastic, not unified, but enough. When she lowered the glass and smiled, there was no triumph in her expression, just certainty, the certainty of someone who believes they've spoken truth and will not be questioned for it. And in that space, between applause and discomforts, something irreversible settled into place. Because once humiliation is repeated publicly, it stops being a misunderstanding. It becomes a pattern everyone is now part of. What followed wasn't confrontation. It was something quieter, and in many ways more devastating. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't leave the room. She didn't ask anyone to defend her. She simply stopped performing. The smiles softened into neutrality. The polite engagement faded into distance. People approached her less, sensing perhaps unconsciously that the role they expected her to play was no longer available. Christopher noticed, but too late. He hovered, uncertain, as if waiting for instructions that never came. When he finally asked if she was okay, she nodded once and said she was tired. Not emotionally, just tired. That answer landed heavier than anger would have. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed She continued receiving guests, laughing easily, retelling the story of the ceremony in her own words. Each retelling shifted the emphasis slightly, polishing her intent, framing herself as principled rather than intrusive. The social narrative bent around her confidence, and then the room began to change. Conversations quieted when Sarah passed. A few guests sought her out privately, touching her arm, offering vague words of support that never quite named what had happened. Others avoided her entirely, choosing comfort over clarity. No one challenged Margaret openly. That absence of challenge was its own form of exposure. Because when behavior is left unchecked in public, it doesn't read as acceptable. It reads as tolerated. And tolerance, in moments like this, carries a judgment of its own. I watched Christopher realize, piece by piece, that the celebration had lost its center. The laughter felt hollow, the dancing uneven. He moved through the reception like someone trying to rewind time without admitting it was gone. Sarah stayed until the final song, not because she wanted to, because leaving earlier would have been turned into another narrative she didn't control. When she finally stepped away, it wasn't dramatic. No announcement, no scene, just a quiet exit with me beside her, the sound of the party receding behind us. And in that quiet, the power Margaret had relied on, attention, compliance, performance, began to slip. Because public moments don't end when the microphone is put down. They end when people stop pretending nothing happened. The days after the wedding were quieter than most people expect. No dramatic fallout, no public statements, just distance settling where celebration was supposed to linger. Sarah didn't reach out right away. Not to me. Not to most people. When she finally did, it wasn't to recount what happened. It was to ask something practical. How to handle vendor follow-ups. What language to use in thank you notes. Logistics first. Emotion later. That ordering told me everything about how she was coping. Christopher tried to normalize things. He spoke about moving forward, about not letting one moment define the marriage. He framed reconciliation as maturity, as compromise, as choosing peace. But peace, when unevenly distributed, is just another form of silence. Margaret never apologized. She spoke instead about intention, about how things had been misunderstood, about how weddings are emotional and people are sensitive. She positioned herself as surprised by the reaction, as if the discomfort itself were unreasonable. Sarah listened. She always listened. But she stopped explaining. That was the shift. She began setting boundaries without announcing them. Shorter visits, fewer shared plans, neutral responses where engagement used to be. It wasn't punishment, it was preservation. The kind that happens when someone realizes that access has been mistaken for entitlement. Christopher struggled with this more than anyone. He kept trying to pull the situation back into a shape that required no one to change too much. But something had already changed fundamentally. Sarah wasn't asking for him to choose between people anymore. She was asking him to recognize what had already been chosen, and that recognition didn't come quickly, which meant the distance, quiet, steady, unmistakable, had room to grow. Time didn't repair what happened, it clarified it. In the weeks that followed, Sarah didn't speak about the wedding unless asked directly. And even then, she chose her words carefully, not to protect anyone else's image, but to protect her own sense of reality. She refused to let the moment be reframed as emotional excess or misunderstanding. What had happened was simple. It had been public, and it had gone unanswered. Christopher eventually tried to revisit it, more seriously this time. He said he understood why she was hurt. He said he wished things had gone differently. But his regret stayed abstract, focused on outcome rather than action, on discomfort rather than responsibility. Margaret remained unchanged. She continued to reference the wedding as a meaningful day, proud of how honest it had been. She spoke of strength and family cohesion, as if the fracture hadn't happened right in front of everyone. Silence, to her, meant closure. To Sarah, it meant clarity. She stopped waiting for validation, stopped hoping for acknowledgement. Instead, she began making decisions with the understanding that boundaries don't require agreement to exist, they only require enforcement. The marriage didn't end dramatically, it thinned. Conversations became careful. Choices became individual. What once felt shared began to feel negotiated. I saw Sarah one last time before she moved out of Charleston. We talked about ordinary things. Work, plans, the future. She didn't speak with bitterness. She spoke with precision. With the calm that comes after a decision has already been made internally. She told me something I think about often. She said, "I learned that silence can be love, but it can also be permission." She had stopped granting it. Weddings are supposed to mark beginnings. But sometimes they also reveal endings that were already waiting. And the most important ones don't happen at the altar. They happen quietly, later, when no one is watching and no one can pretend they didn't see.